Hey everybody, welcome back to Sounds Like a Drum at Cadence Independent Media. Today we are going to do a little throwback Tuesday to some really pitched up snares. And this was a sound kind of in the 90s and the 2000s where people were really like shooting them super high sometimes, and some people have asked about it. And we also wanted to feature a wood drum because we've been doing an awful lot of metal snares lately. So we're going to kind of do two birds today. Also, as a little aside, because of some changes to algorithms and things, some people have been missing notifications on new episodes, so please make sure and click the little bell icon next to the subscribe button below to make sure that you actually get a notification when we drop new episodes. This is particularly a throwback for me because I actually used to tune my snare in high school and sometime in college, kind of like this. And what we're talking about here is not exactly a Piccolo snare sound, but definitely pitched very high. I remember these sounds from like the sort of rap metal crossover stuff, a lot of ska music, some hardcore, some just different things where it's a very short, very cutting, very bright snare sound that just goes right through everything like a gun. And this is not, I guess, as popular these days, but there's still times when it's the right sound, and lots of times where it's kind of a fun sound to use because it takes your mind back to a certain era, kind of like when you hear people, doing lo-fi recordings to sound like the 60s or something like that. And some people have asked specifically about like the Dave Matthews, like the Carter Beauford sort of sound, and I definitely had Under the Table and Drumming back in the day, and he was using one of Jeff Ochiltree's carbon steel drums, and I was expecting it to be a Piccolo based on the recorded sound of the instrument, and it turned out to be a 5 or a 5.5 by 14 with die cast. And I was really surprised because I thought that you needed a smaller drum to get that kind of sound, and it turned out that he was just taking a very standard sized drum, albeit like a 30-pound carbon steel one, but nevertheless, and really kind of cranking it up. And so I'm not sure what size he's using these days. I mean, he's got lots of drums, but it's less about a size and more about a tuning scheme and a couple of little things you can do with your instrument, regardless of the instrument itself, to help get to that sound a little bit easier. So first, let's address some misconceptions. I sort of touched on one there, that you need a small drum to get a high sound. This makes sense mentally because you think a small tom is higher sounding than a low tom. So of course, a smaller drum is going to sound higher. That is sort of true in as far as like how much air is moving and what note is going to occur at a given tension, because when you have more surface area at a certain tension, there's more room for that tension to get dispersed. But the way that a small drum behaves when put at a certain pitch is going to be fatter than if you tuned a larger drum up to that same pitch, because it's going to take a lot more tension to get a 14 to, say, like if you're tuning it to like an A or like some kind of measurement, and you tune a 12 to that same thing, there's a lot less tension in the 12 to get there. So that means that you actually have options with this. You can go for a smaller drum if you want some more warmth at a given pitch range, which sometimes I think is why guys like Gavin Harrison use a smaller drum, or why Benny Greb, who is he does great like fat snare sounds, but he is pretty into 13s. But then on the other hand, like if you listen to Danny Carey, like that's not a low tuned snare, but it's an 8 by 14. So there's a lot of crossover depending on what you want in addition to being at that pitch to come out of the drum. So based on my memories and a few things that I looked up, we decided to go with a maple drum, 5 by 14. This is the House Pearl Masters, and we are doing basically what I would do if somebody said, I need this drum to sound like, 2000, that kind of sound. Which actually happened recently. I did some tracking, and they said all of this stuff is specifically 90s referencing. They gave me a list of tracks, and they're like, we want it to sound like these records. And so I actually did do this like 6 weeks ago, and it was a lot of fun. For that particular situation, I had some snare options. We were at kind of a fancy studio. But right here, we're doing what I would do if this was my drum. We, first of all, are doing coated single ply batter. We're doing standard 3mm snare side. we have put die-cast hoops on this, which we'll get into the why of that shortly. And misconception number 2 is that you have to have this thing tuned super high, especially with regards to the snare side. That's just not true. In order to get articulation, which is part of the reason, or a large part of the reason, I think, why people pitch their snares up, it can come from a lot of different places besides tension. So thing number 2, after, not worrying so much about the drum size, don't think that number 1 thing is to jack up that snare side head. If you've watched our cranked video about that, you know that there's a threshold where you're not going to get tone out of the drum anymore. And if you're going to go high with your drum, you need to maximize the chance that you're going to get tone out of it, or else you're going to end up with a thin sound. And even in bands where I associate them with a highly tuned snare, some records sound better than others with the snare sound specifically. And I feel like I can almost hear that one of them is like, the snare side head is too high, so that when they do a rim shot, the thing is already choked. And they're like, oh, I need more, so they hit it harder, and it gets even more choked. So by all means, tune that head up. And I know this is dicey because I'm not saying like a note or a drum dial measurement or amount of turns or something like that, but I will get into what this one sounds like when we start playing it, and you can kind of hear for yourself what I'm talking about. Number 3, muffling. Ringy snares cut in a different way than muffled snares. Some people say muffling means you can turn it up, which makes it punch out of the mix better. That's true for some music. Other people say you need that ring to get through. Some people will even detune a lug to distort the overtones, to cut through like a distorted guitar cuts through. All of these things are true, and they all work in different contexts. But for me, if I'm going to be pitching a batter head up into this range, there's not that much ring, so I don't really muffle it. If I muffle it at all, it's a small piece of tape, but that's it, like one piece of tape. Because you want that high end because you're trying to cut through. So if you take the high end out with muffling, it's defeating your chances of having the acoustic sound of the drum cut through. And doubly so if you're in a live situation versus a studio thing where like you can manipulate stuff in post-production and that sort of thing. On top of that, we chose die-cast because die-cast hoops are sort of self-muffling to a certain degree. They take a little bit of the wildness out of the overtones. They really focus the rim shot, and they also focus the center sound of the drum. Now, along with this, it's important to mention that your strike zone, when you're dealing with an unmuffled drum, is really important. And one thing I do remember about that Carter Beauford video from the 90s is that they're in a studio, he's playing, so there's fresh heads on everything, so you can see the stick marks accumulate on his drum heads. And on his snare, there are 2 spots like this in the center of the drum where his right stick and his left stick hit, and no marks anywhere else. So that's where that consistent sound comes from, and the center is going to have the least amount of overtones, whether you're catching the rim or not. Sometimes when people say, man, this snare is ringy, the first thing I want to ask is, where are you hitting it, and are you hitting it in the same place every time? The day that I discovered that I had to do that was a sad day, and really precipitated a lot of work and a lot of focus on just chopping that spot that I wanted, and then being able to choose different spots. There's a video from a few weeks ago that has a little bit of more depth about the hoop choice thing. And we will do a video in the future about sort of like strike zone sounds and rim shots, different kinds of rim shots and all that kind of stuff. Okay, and then lastly, snare wire choice. So if everything we're doing is steering toward articulation and cut with the die-cast hoops and the relatively thin heads, single ply heads, we're cranking it up, we're paying attention to the topography of the snare side head, we're not choking that out, all this stuff. If you then throw 42 strand wires on there, you're going to have a kind of fatness, which is awesome, but might not be the thing you're after if you're trying to get that, magnum cut through sound. In my mind, a pitched up snare with wide wires on it is actually a really beautiful sound because it's like fat and also pitched up. And it makes me almost think more like when people take a sample of a fat snare and pitch the sample up. Like that's what that sounds like, because you still have all that wire sound, but and especially in the center of the drum. But then you've also got the shortness of it being cranked up, which is also an awesome sound. So long story short, 24s at the widest, probably 20s are the right choice. You can go narrower than that, and I would encourage you to try it. The narrower you go, also you're going to lose whatever muffling of overtones the wires themselves are doing, which will make the strike zone business even more important. If we had 12s on this, you'd have to really kind of like stay right in the middle and hit that bullseye every time to get the same sound. This has 24s on it right now, and it sounds awesome. Man, that is super loud. Side note, earplugs. I can't stress enough, if you're going to do stuff like this to your snare drum and beat it like this, get earplugs. That's a short sound, and it's a loud sound. And especially coupled with the die-cast hoops, the rim shot is ridiculous. It's short, and you can hear that those overtones are there. But, you know, if you put like one piece of tape on there, like, you know, sort of bent in the middle, that'll quell those. That's enough. You don't need moon gel or any of that kind of stuff. And I can't stress enough that, like, if you start putting a lot of stuff on this, you're going to lose the reason why you would do this. And I mean, a prime example is like all the old Spin Doctors stuff, like Kryptonite or Turn It Upside Down, any of those things. Like, you can hear that drum is ringing, and there might be a little tape on it, but that ring is the character of that type of tuning. And, you know, you might as well use that, because that's part of what makes it awesome. I also associate this sort of sound with the Deftones and some other kind of like even heavier stuff than the funk scene, but I feel like it kind of comes from funk music. I feel like it kind of comes from hip hop and things like that. That's sort of almost like a sample, just like cutting through. And I'm not totally sure why it's not like sort of in vogue right now. Like, some people are still using it, or they'll do it like a side snare thing. But on the other hand, a lot of jazz guys pitch their snare up super high these days. And it's really great, because when you're playing a lot of dense stuff at a low volume, it all comes through really beautifully. And you can be really conversational with your ghost notes. You can still get rolls out of it, provided you haven't cranked up the snare side head too high. And then it's still got some tone with the snares off, because we haven't pitched up the snare side too high. Real quick, because I mentioned it earlier about the pitches or the tensions that the heads are at. It's possible to kind of hear the pitch of the top head because it's not tabletop tight. And the snare side head is up pretty high, but I can still press it in with my thumb. And this is one of those times when it's kind of worth mentioning that, like, definitive pitches don't really define this sound. I don't know the pitch of the batter head, and I don't know the pitch of the snare side head. I just went with my ear and found this sound. Down to where, like, the snare side head doesn't really have a pitch by itself. If I mute this with my hand and tap on it, it doesn't make a note, really. As you can hear, like, if I tap on it with a stick, that seems like it's super duper high, and it is high. Especially for a 14, but it's not choked. It's not like you can't press into it. And earlier when I was setting this drum up, I tuned the batter head to where it made sense and felt good. And then when I did at the snare side, I did the ruler trick, I did all that stuff, and I played the top, and I felt like there wasn't a lot of tone in the center of the drum, which you heard earlier with the wires off. So I took the snare side back down again, and it maybe like a quarter of a turn. And then the tone appeared in the center. And we've got lots of videos that, you know, go over this, so you can go back and check out, like, all the snare tuning little knickknacks and things like that. But the gist of it is that if you're trying to cut with a tuning like this, the cut is in the batter head and the articulation's in the snare side head. And if you just go for cut with the snare side head and go up and up and up and up because you want it to be penetrating and really, really aggressive, you're gonna get to a point quickly where the sound of the drum is not good. It'll be loud and it'll be cutting in a way, but the sound will be unpleasant. it's going to be more painful to your ears than it already is. And especially if you're trying to record it, it's going to sound super thin because the microphones want to hear tone. The close mics want to hear tone. The far mics, everything wants to hear tone out of the drum. And that's why, we spend money on these instruments, is to make sure that you're getting the tone that you want. And if you don't pay attention to this stuff, then it becomes less and less and less relevant what drum you're playing and how you're tuning it. But suffice to say that high is fun, and go as high as you want. Just realize that you can go a lot higher with the batter head than you think maybe you could, but there's a ceiling to the snare side where it's going to start to work against you. So in summation, if you're going for this kind of sound, you don't need a special drum. You can use a regular size drum. You can use regular hoops. Die cast is going to cut a little bit more. Pay attention to the thickness of your batter head and your snare side head. Don't go crazy. Use normal stuff. A center dot is fine. 2-ply might be starting to get a little bit more challenging to get up in that range that you want and have that kind of short cutting sound. Don't go super wide with your snare wires. And man, just don't crank up the snare side head super high. Err on the side of a little bit lower. Make sure that there's tone in the center. If you hit the center and it just goes, "Buh," then that's what it's going to do for everyone else. You're just going to get "Buh" out there, and it's not going to travel very far. So remember tone, remember feel, and crank it up, see what happens. As always, please like, comment, subscribe, hit that little bell next to the subscribe button, and let us know your favorite high snare sounds. I'm always looking for different ones to reference and think about to, lead me and inspire me to different ways. And stay tuned, I'm going to play a little bit for you.